Hello, Joseph Scarbrough here, and I'm going to show you a sewing technique that I recently hit on. Now, when a lot of puppet builders construct their puppets, what they like to do is build the foam skeletons and sew the covering pattern separately, and then they'll take the inner shell of the puppet and stuff that into the covering pattern. I don't like to do that. I find that to be very, very difficult because sometimes you have to worry about, possibly popping seams or stretching the fabric out of shape. Sometimes you won't get it in there just straight. It might come out a little crookedy, and then it takes, a lot of effort to try to straighten it out. When I learned how to build puppets, I learned to sew the covering pattern right over the foam, and that's what I like to do. As I said, I recently hit on a little sewing technique that works well for this that I'm going to show you, and I think you'll find it very useful. If you don't like sewing, if you're inexperienced at sewing, if you're an amateur puppet builder, or just not very good with needles, because unlike a lot of other sewing techniques out there like the Henson stitch or the ladder stitch or the whip stitch, this one is a lot less complicated and, more importantly, a lot less time consuming. So I'm going to show you how to do that. And first things first, I'm going to show you something that I picked up on from Adam Kreutinger, who has a really wonderful puppet building tutorial that I'll link in the description. And of course, for the purpose of a tutorial, you want to use contrasting thread so you can see. Otherwise, you would use the same color thread, which I've already done, as I've already sewn up half this head. So anyway, rather than doubling up the thread and knotting it at the end, here's what you want to do. You want to insert the needle and pull it, but not all the way through. You want to leave just a little bit of a tail there. Then you want to go back close, very close to the same hole, and loop it, but you don't want to pull it too tight. And of course, do it a second time, and once again, you're not going to pull too tight. And then you want to do that about 3 or 4 times, and then on the last time, then you can pull real tight, and that's how you keep your thread from slipping out of place. Alright, now here we're going to get to the actual sewing. Since we started on this side, we're going to go in on this side. And what this stitch is, it's kind of a combination of the baseball stitch and the Henson stitch. So, pull that through. And what you're going to do is go across to the other side, stick your needle through, and pull it. And when you're sewing, you don't want to pull too tight on the thread, because that'll cause your seam to sort of gather and bunch up, which you don't want. But you do want to pull it just snug enough so you'll get a secure stitch. So basically, as you can see, what I'm doing is I'm just going back and forth, in and out, just like that. Back and forth, in and out like this. Now, when a lot of puppet builders are sewing, they say you want to get as close to the edge of the fabric as possible to minimize the seam appearance. I find that's not always particularly the case, because sometimes when you sew too close to the edge of the fabric, the edges will kind of compress together like that, and you'll get little ridges, so to speak, and that kind of, I find, emphasizes the appearance of the seam even more. And also, when you're working with a fleece such as this, sometimes the edges, the pilling will sort of flake off and leave bare edges. With this sewing technique, I find that you don't want to sew too close to the edge, but at the same time, you don't want to sew too far away from the edge either, because that will show the thread a lot more. So as I say, it's just back and forth, in and out, like this. And this is how it's like the baseball stitch. Now, here is where it's like the Henson stitch. After you get to sewing, you want to go back take your needle and you want to sort of lightly scratch over where you just sewed, because what this does is it sort of digs up all that pilling that got trapped underneath the thread, and you're sort of brushing it over the thread to help hide the seam. So as you can see, you can just barely make out the seam here. And another thing too is notice how I'm sort of angling the needle as I sew. That helps a lot too. And one last note I do want to mention is that this particular sewing technique, it works better when your edges are as straight as possible. When you get to curved edges, it's sort of more difficult to do, which I'll show you on another puppet that I've been working on. As you can see here, the underside of the arm was seamed and stitched, underside of the hand, and that looks pretty good. But then we get to the tips of the fingers and it's more difficult to sew, so the seam is a little more noticeable because it's more difficult on curved edges. So anyway, that's my particular sewing technique that I like to use, and I just wanted to share that with people who may be looking for different sewing techniques to do when they're building puppets.